And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called The Joy of Flying, released in 1979. This was an album that saw a lot of variety. For instance, Tony alternates between various settings. In 2 tracks he's in duets, on other songs in a quartet. The music is a mix of R&B and jazz. One of the standout tracks is the song Morgan's Motion, which sees Williams alongside pianist Cecil Taylor in a very moving collaboration. Emergency was released in 1969. This was one of the influential albums from the fusion era of the 60s that bridged the gap between rock and jazz music. The music is very adventurous and creates some great sonic landscapes full of mystery and intrigue. On this album, he is joined by guitarist John McLaughlin and organist Larry Young. An album called Foreign Intrigue, released in 1985. This one has a very buoyant, spirited set of tracks. Williams is very powerful on drums. He alternates between various styles and rhythms as he collaborates with his bandmates Ron Carter on bass, Muldrow Miller on piano and others. Many of the songs in the album were original compositions by Williams that showcased various aspects of drumming technicalities like the tracks Arboretum, Clearways and so forth. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called The Joy of Flying, released in 1979. During his career, Tony Williams managed to carve a niche for himself as one of the greatest jazz drummers in the world, many of them alongside his iconic fusion group starring names like Larry Young, John McLaughlin and Jack Bruce. His albums are a testimonial to his composition and innovative prowess. The album The Joy of Living was one of his tour de forces in like vein from the late 70s. The album sees an incomparable lineup: Cecil Taylor, Ronnie Montrose, Jan Hammer and others. The album was produced by Williams and it was the final fusion album that he created. The opening track was written by Jan Hammer. This one's a rock and jazz fusion-oriented song which sees William in top form, going about it with a very peppy, flamboyant drum beat. A funky jazz track called Hip Skips. This one's also seen notable success as a sports TV show soundtrack. There's a great song called Hittin' on 6. This song was written by Tom Scott, which sees Hancock and Williams dazzling on synth and drums. The sound is very vibrant. A very hard rock piece called Open Fire. This one's a great jazz and rock fusion track. Another Jan Hammer composition called Eris. Another great synth fusion track. And Coming Back Home, a great track that sees William blazing away on drums and George Benson's guitar playing is very complex and dynamic. Emergency was released in 1969. This one's a double long play album that bridges the gap between jazz and rock. Williams and John McLaughlin on guitar and Tony Williams on drums explore uncharted musical landscape, fusing the dynamic and the brilliant to create a mesmerizing compilation of songs. In some ways, this album was one of the pioneering albums of the jazz fusion movement at the time. One of the highlights of the album is the song Vashka, where we get a glimpse of Tony backed by Hammond organ music. It's a piece that can play out in different ways. For instance, Carla Bley once performed it as a very nostalgic piece, and in Tony's debut album Lifetime, this piece becomes an up-tempo song. In this album also, Tony Williams drives the piece with pulsating drum rhythms to its dynamic conclusion, powered by the backdrop instrumentals. Another great piece called Sangria for 3. This one was penned by Williams himself and showcases everything that his band was famous for, the groundbreaking genre-blending styles that became their niche. The track combines everything from free-form improvisation and jam sessions to acid rock grooves in a jazzy theme. Also, Tony Williams is on vocals on 3 of the tracks. He's on vocals on a groovy funky track called Via the Spectrum Road, also on one of his hit songs from his live tours, Rain on the Ground, and on the piece Where, which was composed by John McLaughlin. One highlight of his vocals is that he appears to be speaking and singing at the same time, which lent to the innovative essence of his album. And an album called Foreign Intrigue. This one was another great tour de force from the 18th Renaissance period that sees Tony sizzling on drums. So it was 1985 and there was an epic concert in New York City, a great lineup featuring names like Tony Williams, Herbie Hancock, Michael Petrucciani and a lot of others for a celebration of Blue Note Records. The Blue Note label had faded due to the fading of disco and fusion, but then in the 80s, thanks to the works of acoustic jazz greats like Dexter Gordon, it had resurfaced. So at that ceremony, Tony Williams was one of the highlights, reuniting with Blue Note Records after 20 years. He compiled some of his best performances from that performance into the album Foreign Intrigue. The quintet joining him on the album combined a mix of old and new names, from Ron Carter on bass to Wallace Rooney on trumpet. Williams pounds away on the drums throughout the performances. Also, his compositions are another highlight. Many of his compositions were deeply technical innovations. The song Arboretum was an exercise in the art of synchronizing melodies. Another track, Clearways, an exercise in chords and harmonies. Other compositions are based off classics. A beautiful Miles Davis-inspired classic with a Spanish tune, the title track, and a tribute to his wife called My Michelle. There's some very peppy dance theme tunes like the salsa theme track Life of the Party and the bluesy hard pop classic Taking My Time, and a Wynton Marsalis composition called Sister Cheryl that went on to become a classic. So that was some insight into more of Tony Williams' best albums of all time, and you're tuned into the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. This is the Weekend Jazz Update with Yashani Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. Now let's have some trending album news. There's a brand new album up for release by New Zealand-based jazz icon Jim Patterson. The album is a compilation of conversations between Kim and a close friend of hers expressed through the music. Kim Patterson and Alex Wentling, who collaborates with her on this album, are united by a mutual love of jazz. Growing up, they would listen to music together and perform together. Their friendship spans more than 10 years. So this album is a tribute, a musical snapshot to those moments that they shared growing up, their favorite tracks, their personal takes on the music and more. The album is now up for release on Thick Records, also available on all streaming platforms. Kim Patterson's a jazz legend hailing from New Zealand. His playing is deep and flowing, and he starred alongside other jazz greats like Bernie McGann and Mike Knock. Alex Wentling's a musical educator, pianist and composer also hailing from New Zealand. For more information, please visit www.thickrecords.co.nz. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Tony Williams' best albums of all time. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Spring, released in 1965. This album is full of Tony's original compositions, and joining him on the album is a series of great musicians like Wayne Shorter and Sam Rivers. Many of the tunes are groundbreaking and adventurous. Some examples: Extras, Echo, From Beyond and more. Civilization was released in 1987. This was Williams' debut record as leader of Hard Bop Quintet. Joining him on this album are Billy Pierce on saxophone, Wallace Rooney on trumpet and others. There's 8 complex original compositions by Williams, and his high energy drumming drives the music backed by some beautiful solos. And Play or Die released in 1980. So it was the late 80s and Williams' original chord was disintegrating. The album title stems from that incident and was recorded during a live tour in Europe. The music bridges the boundaries of jazz fusion, new wave and rock music. The album is also a tribute to the jazz fusion era of the 80s with its multi-layered genres. So that was some insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshani Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Spring, released in 1965. So it was 1965 and Tony Williams was one of the top up-and-coming drummers in the jazz world. He'd already played alongside the great Miles Davis and was becoming famous for his ability to weave complex rhythms together. Many players were staying true to the norm while others were innovating. Music from that era was generally described as post-bop. Into that atmosphere, Tony Williams carved a niche with his groundbreaking albums like Lifetime, also playing alongside other great bands like his collaborations with Eric Dolphy on his album Out to Lunch. When Williams recorded Spring in 1965, it came on top of another great album, Lifetime, which made Tony Williams one of the leading jazz artists of his time. Spring defined his style, weaving various rhythms together. Joining him on the album were fellow bandmates from his days with Miles Davis, Wayne Shorter on saxophone and pianist Herbie Hancock. There was also bassist Gary Peacock and Sam Rivers on saxophone. They play each of the tunes on the album in breathtaking style. Each of the players has a chance to stretch out, showcasing their individual prowess. Also, all the compositions, 5 of them all in all, were Williams' original compositions. The first tune's a wild one. It's called Extras and it sees Tony and Shorter alternating on solos. The tune's very enigmatic and complex and has no real niche. On the second tune, Echo, Williams is on his own, mesmerizing with some epic drum solos. On From Before, it's Hancock that takes the spotlight, mesmerizing with his rapid piano playing. So this album is an example of the innovative jazz styles that characterized the post-bop era of the 60s. A lot of experimentation, swinging melodies and improvisation that defined that genre. Another album called Civilization, released in 1987. This one was Williams' debut album alongside Hard Bop Quintet. Nevertheless, many of the players collaborating with him on this album also had started alongside him before. Musicians like Wallace Rooney on trumpet and pianist Marlboro Miller. The highlight of this album is how Tony drives the music, 8 original compositions with his hardcore drumming. Also, Wallace Rooney does a great job of emulating Miles Davis in the music. And since Miles Davis and Tony Williams had played together before, this album is also a throwback to his early days alongside the Miles Davis Quintet. The 8 compositions are very complex and innovative and give the listener a great ride. And Play or Die, released in 1980. The rather distressing title of this album was due to the fact that, as Tony Williams himself said in 1980, when this album was made on tour in Germany, his band was slowly disintegrating. The keyboardist Frank Zappa was the only one that remained from his old glory days. On this album, there's Patrick O'Hara stepping in as bassist. The ultimate output was incredible. The 3 of them mesmerized the audience together. In Grant's own words, as soon as Patrick started playing, it was like we'd taken off on a spaceship. So in 1980, 5 compositions were recorded together by the trio for the album Play or Die, a very mesmerizing compilation of songs. On Beach Ball Tango, the opening track, we see Williams playing the tom-toms. The theme is simple yet dazzling. It's Williams who portrays each of the tracks differently with a varied style to his playing. Jam Piece is an equally gentle, simple melody over a darker sounding background, with Williams sounding more foreboding on drums. The style changes to a cheery paced drum rhythm on the song Big Man. The final composition was penned by Williams and went on to become one of his best songs, There Comes a Time. This one plays out with a very fast-paced, exciting rhythm. Play or Die basically showcases what was mesmerizing about Tony's style, his ability to bring out various flavors in the music by varying his style. So that was some insight into more of Tony Williams' best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. On this week's episode, Tony Williams, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now let's recap what we were discussing during this program. So on this week's episode, it's all about Tony Williams. He started out with Miles Davis, where he made a name for himself as a very innovative drummer. He started out playing the drums at age 11. By 15, he was touring in Boston. He was then recruited to Miles Davis Quintet, where his rhythmic innovations made him one of the most sought-after jazz drummers of his time. He started out solo in the late 60s and debuted on Blue Note Records with the album Lifetime, which went on to become a classic. Other great albums he produced included Angel Street, Native Heart, Foreign Intrigue, and Spring. He also formed an iconic fusion group alongside John McLaughlin and Larry Young that was all about blending jazz and rock. In the 80s, he headed another post-pop quintet featuring Wallace Roney. Their repertoire included almost exclusively Williams' original compositions. So that was a bit of insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Lifetime, released in 1964. This was Tony's debut album and sees him alongside a great lineup. One highlight of the album is that Williams wrote all 4 compositions on the album himself, and each piece sees a different combination of musicians performing it. The music is very innovative and unpredictable, and is a mesmerizing performance from beginning to end. Wilderness was released in 1996. This album sees Tony paired alongside an all-star quintet. The music plays out as string and orchestra music. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. Don't forget you can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.